Здравствуйте, уважаемые участники, уважаемые обучающиеся школ, вузов, уважаемые коллеги. Сегодня у нас с вами состоится мастер-класс, четвертый мастер-класс в нашем образовательном проекте «Синология онлайн 2.0. Тенденции в современном искусстве Китая». Вот. И сегодня у нас в гостях человек, который сейчас находится в другом часовом поясе, сейчас в Таиланде, в Бангкоке, мой уважаемый коллега Реми Жарри, PhD. Реми получил в Китайской академии искусств по китайскому искусству в Ханчжоу. Реми Жарри является профессором Университета Чулалонгкорна, Бангкок, и адъюнкт-профессором Парижского католического университета. Мы с профессором Реми познакомились на одной из стажировок, конференций в Гонконге, которую организовывала организация, так называемая SDCF, Sinological Development Charitable Foundation. Вот. Потом в прошлом году мы с профессором Реми встречались на полях конференции в Дунхуане, делали доклады по тематике, по наследию Дунхуана, по переводу наследия Дунхуана. И вот до сих пор очень хорошо общаемся, и я пригласил его в этот проект, чтобы профессор Реми прочитал вот такую интересную лекцию как раз по теме своей специализации по современному искусству Китая. И сегодня я хочу сказать, что лекция у нас будет на английском языке. Вот, все вопросы вы можете задавать в чат. Значит, сначала, как обычно, будет лекция, час 15, час 20. Потом профессор Реми ответит на ваши вопросы. Поэтому просьба писать все вопросы на английском языке. Да, уже непосредственно профессор зайдет в чат и посмотрит все ваши вопросы и ответит на них. Вот, будет презентация, так что, надеюсь, будет всем интересно. Спасибо большое. So now I want to introduce my colleague, my dear colleague, Professor Remi, Dr. Remi. He is a lecturer in Chulalongkorn University in Bangkok and adjunct professor at the Catholic University of Paris. So, Dr. Remi Jarri, please, I give you word.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yeah, nice.
Yes, so
yes.
I'm going to share the screen. Thank you for this host disabled attendee screen sharing. I think
so in the screen, green bottom, demonstration of screen.
Yeah, but host disabled attendee screen sharing.
So now is it okay?
Let me check again. Yes, perfect.
Yeah, nice.
So I'm going to share. Yes, so you should see the whole file. Is it available now for you? Perfect.
Perfect, yeah.
So thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure. It's my first time I'm going to teach in Russia, so I'm very glad and excited. Hello, everyone. So I will actually start right away. So by introducing this topic, discussing with Vlad, we decided to speak about modernity in Chinese art. So if you like ancient art, you may not be disappointed, because actually half of my presentation will be about ancient and traditional art, because I do think that to understand modernity, or if this concept makes sense in the Chinese cultural environment, to understand this modernity, you need actually to look back at this cultural heritage, to see how modern things, modern elements appeared. So defining modernity, I just want to start from scratch with very basic definitions. So as you can see, modern, we consider modern when it's related to present time, to recent time, opposed to the past. And modernity, it's actually the quality of being modern. So here is actually the core topic for modernity in Chinese art. Because if it's, let's say, modern in a Chinese context, it might not be actually modern in a Western context, and inversely. So to take a very basic example, oil painting in a Western context, including in Russia, is actually considered as, let's say, a traditional media. But in the Chinese context, oil painting will appear as, let's say, more modern versus ink painting on paper or ink painting on silk. So everything will be actually considered from the perspective of this, let's say, cultural background. So to go a little bit more into details about this modernity, so I will start actually to adopt a Western perspective, but that will be actually, my goal is to overcome this Western perspective, because I do dislike ethnocentrism. So if we see every single thing from the Western perspective, that will be actually a clear problem. So let's start from the West anyway. So what happened when this modern art appeared in the Western context? We've seen that the artists started to depart from mimesis. What we call mimesis is actually the representation of the world as it is. Okay, from the Renaissance until modern art, until the 20th century, you can see that artists try to copy the world very, let's say, accurately, almost like a photographer could do, okay? So from modern art period, we will see that artists will actually start new kind of representation, partly because actually there is the photography since the 19th century. So if a photographer can do anything like a photographic representation, there is no need anymore. Then second aspect, emancipation from the academic convention. So all over the century, and that's exactly the same in the Chinese art, we have the accumulation of academic convention. So in terms of perspective, how to structure the space in the painting, for example, in terms of art genre, so history painting will be, let's say, more prestigious than still life, for example. And so we have also hierarchy, and then also appropriate theme and media. All this has been very, very structured. So modern art will try to actually overcome these restrictions. And last but not least, there is also a keen interest in non-Western civilization, to look outside. So we all know that Picasso had a great interest in African art, Vincent van Gogh in Japanese art, and so on and so forth. And beside non-Western civilization, we also see some modern artists who look at, let's say, alien people, people with mental disabilities, to actually get out of this, let's say, very Western and very restricted framework. So what about the Chinese context? Because what I just introduced is the specific, let's say, context and the specific motivation of Western modern artists. So of course, starting from a very different, let's say, traditional background, Chinese modern artists will look differently. So this is why I will start to introduce some key elements of the tradition, artistic tradition in China. Then in second part, I will try to map Chinese modernity. So I will use, let's say, 3 different, let's say, elements to make it simple, so that you can remember it easily. And then I will go a little bit over this idea of modernity, to introduce this concept of postmodernity that I find more appropriate to understand as a whole the, let's say, ancient art and also this modern and contemporary art that we can find in China. So what about tradition in Chinese art? So as for the Western tradition, I will summarize and I will simplify a lot, okay? So if you have extra knowledge, of course, you will not find everything. I just have, I cherry-picked some elements that I find interesting. So first, in terms of the relationship of Chinese characters, so language, writing, literature, and this idea of mimesis that I introduced. So mimesis representing the world. Because when we look at Chinese characters, what is very interesting, unlike Cyrillic alphabet or Latin alphabet, some characters have actually a direct link with the world. They are not just arbitrary elements. They are actually, some of them, not all of them, but some of them have evolved into, let's say, complex characters. But for this particular Hanzi, Gui, we can still now, in the traditional version, recognize the shape, the simplified and the abstract shape of a turtle. So this is actually very, very different because we know that in Western art, abstraction was extremely important and that was very new. But this process of abstraction somehow happened during the ancient time. Here you see, let's say, a wider perspective of these ancient characters from the Diaguren, the oral bone script that you see on your left, until the traditional and the simplified characters, and I also added the pinyin. So actually, this process of somehow giving a more abstract representation of the world is not so far. I'm not saying that Mondrian took inspiration in Chinese art, but it's not so far from what happened in modern art to some extent. So here you have actually the famous series of Mondrian's trees. So Piet Mondrian is a Dutch artist who spent most of his career in Paris. And he really jumped into abstraction. He started as a figurative painter, so not so realistic as you can see at first, and then he jumped into pure abstraction. So here, step by step, you see the different evolution of his style. So from a tree that we can still recognize, we move to something much more geometric. So again, I think that's a very interesting parallel. And what is more, in terms of Chinese characters, you also have very interesting symbols behind. It's not just, for some characters, they are very abstract, not so much, let's say, visual or pictographic elements, but what matters most for some of them is actually their symbolic value. So here I picked up Wang. So you probably have seen this character. It's a very famous family name, but it's also the term for king. And what is very interesting in the structure of this character, you have three parallel lines and then linked with a vertical line. And it actually symbolizes the cosmology in China. So on top, you have Tian, the sky, in the middle, Ren, people, human beings, and Di on the ground, the earth. And this vertical line is actually symbolizing Tianzi, the emperor or the king. That is actually the connection between heaven, the human world, and the earth. So at a very, very early stage, you can find like very interesting symbolic elements. And what is quite interesting, when we look back at the Western tradition and modern art, among the masters, there is obviously Malevich. You, as Russian, you probably know more than I do about Malevich. But he's, so again, I'm not saying that Malevich looked at Chinese characters and imported that into the Russian context. That's not my elements. I just want you to see the perspective of Chinese characters, and for some of them, the very geometric structure that they have. So that's why I did this parallel with actually Malevich paintings and Chinese characters. And I will just give an extra word about the one in the back, on top of black cross. You see this, let's say, cross, a very clear cross. In modern Chinese, we pronounce this term ya. This is ya, the Yazhou, so for Asia. But in ancient time, it has a different meaning, and it was actually symbolizing the cosmology structure of ancient China, with the 4 directions, and in the middle, that was actually the location of the Tianze, the emperor. So what I want you to remember here is actually from the very ancient step, Chinese civilization has a keen interest in geometric elements, and in particular, the square. So what we consider now as Westerner, as an element of modernity, this geometric abstraction, something that we haven't really seen before, it's actually, in Chinese context, is actually very, very ancient. And on the very top, you can see also this square with 2 lines in the middle. So this is the character for Tian, for field, and it's actually pictographic because it's supposed to represent actually a field that is structured into parcels, okay? And you can also recognize Wang, so king, and Zhong, the Zhongguo, that has some geometric elements. So just to illustrate a little bit more this interest in the square structure and very geometric element that you can still find actually in architecture. If you go to temples in Beijing, or if you look at the structure of the Gugong, you will see that it's actually very, very square. So this actually comes from the Ming Tong, the image that you see on your right-hand side. So from very, very early time, this was supposed to summarize actually the whole world, with right in the middle, the Tianze, the emperor, that is, let's say, controlling the world and articulating with heaven and the earth. And on the left side, you also have like very geometric elements that are actually very, very ancient. That's among the first element that we have from Chinese civilization. So a B and a song. So you can see that nothing organic here. It's just like a circle or a geometric element. So another element I want to mention to approach modernity in Chinese context is this long-lasting tradition of calligraphy, because I already introduced this abstraction process that has accompanied the development of Hanzi, of the Chinese characters, but the art of calligraphy itself is also interesting because there is no equivalent in the Western context. So that's very important because we can see among contemporary artists a revival of ink painting first, and a reenactment of the tradition of calligraphy through different field, performance, and things like that. And what I particularly like, actually, it's like doing calligraphy, it's not only about let's say, painting, it's also about gesture, okay? So there is this element that matters a lot for contemporary artists. It's actually a mix of representation, painting, but also something very performative, or performing, like a little bit like an actor or a dancer. So here you have also some example of grid that were used for these characters. So about artistic convention, I just want to again cherry pick some elements that I find interesting. The first one is the perspective. as you can see here on this slide, you recognize the typical isometric perspective that you find in Western art since Renaissance. So that's something that modern Western artists have changed, okay? But again, in Chinese context, this is very, very different. To summarize, I can say that in this particular painting, a very famous one by Frank Wan, so probably a copy, you can see that what is the further is actually the bigger, and what is the closest from the viewer is actually the smallest. This is exactly the contrary that we find in Western painting and landscape since Renaissance. Okay, so in this black and white picture, you can recognize the different field, the different levels of representation. So in the back, you have this huge mountain that actually occupies with the sky 2/3 of the painting. Then you have an intermediate background, so isolated with this red line. And then you have the foreground with the blue line. So you see that the closest from you, the smallest. And to the point that actually in this closer background, you, after a while, you recognize you have some characters, some people with probably donkeys walking on the road. So that's actually tiny, tiny, tiny. You really need time to find them. So I will not develop about actually the philosophical background. That's really the idea that humans are part of the cosmos. So that's a very interesting actually representation of this philosophical background that is very important at that time during Song Dynasty. Then continuing about the representation of nature, I also selected Maren, a very interesting artist. Here you can see that it's not so much about detail, but recognizing any specific lake or sea. It's more about the style and how the artist will capture the essence of water, of this sea, of the elements as a whole. So when we look at that, if we are very familiar and structured with Western culture, we will find it very minimalist, very clean, very pure, but almost like empty. So this is actually minimalism. It's actually an art movement that developed after the Second World War in the US. But actually, some, let's say, elements, artistic elements, could be found much, much earlier in the Chinese context. So again, another challenge to look at modernity. Here, I will go very fast. It's just to show you that sometimes, even, let's say, in the representation of cities, the geometry could be very, very strong with this blue zigzag that you can find in murals in the famous cave in Dunhuang. And then to close down this, let's say, insight into Chinese landscape painting, you can see again with this, let's say, more recent or less ancient painting, that it's definitely not about getting closer to this mimesis. Is again to capture the essence of the mountain, and to the point that in the first in the painting on your left side by Wang Meng, some actually compare the top of the mountain with actually the top of the spine of a buffalo. So sometimes it's actually very interesting to see that the tension of what should be mineral and natural is start to be a little bit organic. You will never imagine at first, if you're not familiar with Chinese painting, the spine of a buffalo on top of the top of the buffalo. About Castiglione, I will mention it later. I just want to mention that from an early stage, Sing Dynasty, Chinese artists also got inspiration from Western artists, and Giuseppe Castiglione, a major artist in the Qing dynasty coming from Italy. So here you can see that he introduced a new kind of perspective, inspired by, obviously, the Western art, especially with the pavement on the ground. And then when we look at something that is actually very realistic, what in the Chinese context, what is very interesting is actually it relies on the texture of the material. Here you have the two treasures of the National Palace Museum in Taiwan. And these are very famous because they are carved in natural stone. So the green color that you see on the cabbage is actually the real material. And the same with the meat-shaped stone. Here, it's actually a real stone, but the artist actually wanted to keep this essence. So that's still this idea of qi, capturing the essence of elements, but here turning into something figurative, surprisingly. And to close down this, let's say, overview of Chinese tradition, that's actually come back from a very first encounter with Chinese ceramics. I was stunned by the fact that some of these ancient vases look extremely modern. So here I've selected the Clair de Lune glaze vase. As you can see, it's from Qing Dynasty, the Kangxi period. And if you find this randomly on the shelf, you will never imagine, looking at first sight, that this is actually a nearly 3 centuries vase, because the shape is so pure, the color is so fresh. That's actually very hard. So that's actually, you understand that it starts to challenge our idea of modernity. Okay, and then on the other side, you have this song that I introduced earlier, and you see that actually the same shape will evolve and be transferred in other mediums, such as ceramics here. So the middle one is actually a vase in ceramic, not a jade song anymore. So as a transition between this, let's say, traditional background and modern background, I also want to speak about Scholars' Rock. This is a long-lasting tradition among literati in China. So what is very interesting in Scholars' Rock, so you see one on your left side, these actually are somehow ready-mades. If you are familiar with this concept of ready-mades coined by Marcel Duchamp, it's actually an artwork that you don't touch. Marcel Duchamp famously took a urinal in ceramics and say that, oh, this is a work of art. So again, I'm not saying that he got inspiration from the literati, but the literati at that time in ancient China, what they did is actually they selected natural stone that they find beautiful. So especially from Taihushi, from a specific lake near Suzhou. And then they arrange them with this pedestal. But what matters in this tradition of Scholars' Rock is you're not supposed to touch them. You're not supposed to make the holes bigger. They have to be naturally beautiful, okay? So that's also a very interesting, let's say, elements to keep in mind to challenge, again, this idea of Chinese modernity. So let's go into detail. So again, I cannot, let's say, encompass the variety of Chinese modern art, but to make it simple and, let's say, a clear introduction, I took as a reference this book by my former, actually, supervisor for my PhD, Gao Shengming. He did this book with the famous curator and gallerist in Hong Kong, Professor Chang. So they isolated 3 main sources of Chinese modern art. These sources are actually literati, ancient art, Chinese tradition. And there is also the socialist art, the revolutionary art, because of course, since 1949, China is, mainland China is a democratic republic. So it's still has a communist system. So of course, after so much years, there was a very specific iconography that has been developed through propaganda and so on. So this is still present in contemporary art, and this has been changed a little bit, transformed and adapted to modern time. And the last element is, let's say, the global world, a little bit like our Western modern artists, what is not Chinese, basically. And we can see that there is a very deep dialogue with all the different civilization and artistic tradition. So let's start with literary and ancient art and do this bridge between ancient to modern time. So you can recognize again this scholar's rock and this sculpture by Jan Wang. He did a lot of this aluminum sculpture. So of course, the link is very, very clear, but the material is completely artificial, as you can see. And these sculptures are also extremely monumental. Here you can see the scale of this rock number 59 that was exhibited at the British Museum. So, and then this metallic and let's say reflecting surface make it like extremely futuristic. So that's a very interesting contrast, because when you remember the origin of Pyrrhushus, the scholar's rock, it's a very interesting evolution. So you can see a lot of examples of this dialogue between modern contemporary art and ancient art. Here you have a second example by Chen Zhen. So on top you have a bianzhong. A bianzhong, as you can see, is actually an ancient musical instrument. And Chen Zhen recreated actually a modern bianzhong. So it actually creates sounds. You cannot, let's say, play with it. The sounds come from electric speakers. Okay, and the circular shape actually are matong, so they are actually urinals. So it's actually playing with the different level of culture, what is actually the lowest level, like a recipient where you are satisfying your need, was not in the Chinese context a type of object that we will preserve or respect. But he wanted actually to do the contrary, a little bit like the Western modern artist, trying to find, let's say, this kind of scene that will never represent. So that's why actually you have so many prostitutes in modern art representation. So here it's also this kind of, let's say, perspective. Then in this dialogue, you also have a very interesting artist named Gu Wenda. So Gu Wenda is famous for using human hair. So every time I share this with my student, there is like a very freaky reaction. So human hair, at first, like in our Western context, we always think of Shoah, the Nazi regime, and all the very awful period. But in the Chinese context, it's actually very, very different. I will explain why. Actually, hair from very ancient time was an extremely precious element in your body. Okay, it's linked actually to this famous saying that you see in Chinese. The skin and the hair belongs to your ancestor. You get them from your ancestors, from your parents and grandparents. So traditionally, it was not possible for Chinese to cut their hair. So that's why in ancient time, you see all these men and women tying up their hair, because it was not possible to cut it. This has changed, as you can see, during Qing dynasty, a dynasty that was Manchurian and not Han anymore. And actually, they asked the men, as you can see, to shave the front part of the head. So that was actually a trauma for a lot of Chinese, of Han Chinese, because this meant that you will actually challenge your loyalty towards your ancestors. So it's actually a problem that you see also with the arrival of Buddhism, because Buddhist monks were asked to shave their whole head. So that was actually, in Chinese context, that was also a problem with this, let's say, ancestral link and worship. So here is actually one of the reasons why Gu and Da pays so much attention to hair, because he find out that actually the perspective of this material, human hair, could be very different from one cultural context to the other. So he actually on purpose want to explore this very subversive perspective and material. So here actually he constructed something that looks a little bit like the Great Wall in bricks made out of human hair. So that's very, very specific. And when you get close, you can see that they're actually very soft and have a specific smell. So, and last but not least, on your right-hand side, you see actually some ink stick that have been made out of human hair. So Gu and Da is actually often painting with black ink made out of human hair. So there is also this essential link, maybe not with qi, but with human material. That makes it actually very, very interesting. Because if we go back to our mimesis theme, when you look at this sculpture installation, okay, made out of hair, it's a little bit a part of yourself. Maybe it's not your specific hair, but it's actually human substance. So that will actually break this usual relationship with the viewer of representation. This can still represent some characters, some shapes, things like that. But once you know that it's your own substance, that completely change. You definitely keep that in mind. And I also want to insist on this resilience of tradition culture with Cai Guoqiang. So Cai Guoqiang is the artist that you've seen on the invitation for this lecture, okay? And the one, the installation you see in the back of my screen. Okay, so Cai Guoqiang, beside this famous installation, was also famous with gunpowder painting. So this particular painting actually was not painting by hand. He's first putting some gunpowder and then let it explode. So that's why you have this kind of very primitive effect. So why gunpowder? So there are many, many reasons, but one of them is obviously that gunpowder was invented by the Chinese. So that's actually a kind of acknowledgement and artistic use of something that was not artistic but deeply Chinese. Okay, and on top of that, I do think that Cai Guoqiang likes to not completely control the process of creating a painting. So that's something that we can find also in Western modern art. And this idea of sharing the creative process and not, let's say, over controlling the representation, to let, let's say, chance complete the work. I will also introduce two other artists because of their specific media, the use of the media. The first one is Lin Tianmiao, so a famous female artist, and also famous because she's using silk. So silk is also an invention by the Chinese civilization. We are now doing silk all over the world, but the secret actually of making silk was kept by the Chinese civilization for a long, long time, until nearly the 18th century. So that's actually why China was leading the luxury business with ceramics, porcelain, and also silk. So Lin Tianmiao, and speaking about ceramics and porcelain, Liu Dianhua is also very famous for using this particular material. So what looks like drips on the wall, it's actually ceramics. Okay, and the installation in the lower part of your slide is also all made in porcelain. So he's actually reviving something very important in the Chinese heritage. And in terms of convention, what is very important to remember in the Chinese context is that there is not this hierarchy between fine art and decorative art. In Western context, we will we used to, it has changed, but we used actually to give more value to paintings, sculptures, fine art works versus applied art, like ceramics, furniture, and so on. But in the Chinese context, actually ceramics is one of the most precious artworks. So although you may find it as a vase, as a functional item, this is not a reason why they will put ceramics lower than other art genre. So that's very interesting in the Western and Chinese perspective to compare and see that during this modern era, everything actually come to pretty much the same level. Now let's move to this socialist heritage. So everything linked to Marxism, revolution, and so on. So actually, as you will see, some elements will come from the ex-USSR, the Soviet time, because China took inspiration at first from that. So the first example I want to share with you is this installation by Wu Shanjuan. So it's actually a very messy space, as you can see, lots of Chinese characters that you can recognize, a mix of white, blue, and red. If you're not familiar with Chinese history, you might be a bit puzzled at first. But the link is very, very clear for those who have lived through the Cultural Revolution. So, for example, during Cultural Revolution, there was this spread of Dazubao. This is this kind of posters that you see on the wall here during the Cultural Revolution. So they aim at sharing your ideas about Marxism, Mao Zedong thought, and so on. And some were also used to denounce people who were not following actually the principle of the revolution. So on the very right hand side, you have actually one of the Dazubao that has been preserved from Cultural Revolution. And you can see it at the Propaganda Museum in Shanghai. So again, you can see here that there is a dialogue. And this dialogue has also been engaged by Gu Wendao, this artist who used human hair. He was also deeply inspired by this Dazubao to give, let's say, more humanistic side to what remains a traumatic episode of Chinese history. Now, beside this, you also have the remodeling process of the political propaganda. So on your right-hand side, you have actually images from the Chinese propaganda, typical images of workers, invitation and engagement to join the revolution and to be a good citizen and so on. And on the left side, as you can see, it's not anymore political propaganda. You see, surprisingly, famous Western brands being mixed with iconic representation of workers. So Chanel is famous for luxury and, let's say, not revolutionary at all. It's a symbol of capitalism, superficial needs, and so on. So here you can see this synthesis by Wang Guangyi. And Wang Guangyi wants also to actually witness the rise of this billionaire in China and this new era that started after the Cultural Revolution, this opening to capitalism and so on. So that's an interesting image. You may not like it, you may find it a little bit easy or so on, but that's actually an interesting, let's say, aspect of the modern art scene in China. And another example that you may find a little bit more familiar, I don't know, you can recognize some former Russian leaders. And here you have the new version by Remi Jarri. So mixing, you can still have in the Remi Jarri painting, you still have Lenin, but mixed with this smiling Chinese guy and what looks like Superman. And the very last figures is actually a bell that looks very much like the style of Picasso. So that's actually a good summary of a lot of elements I just mentioned. The Western influence with Superman, the socialist heritage with Lenin, and then also some elements from modernity, Picasso. And I also added the original poster, the political propaganda of that time, 1968. So that was actually 2 years after the beginning of the Cultural Revolution. So this propagandist imagery has actually turned into a lot of direction, and some of them are actually extremely subversive. Some of the paintings that you're going to see are made by Chinese artists, but it may not be available for Chinese viewers, and they might be censored. So obviously this one mixing the shape of Marilyn and Mao Zedong, so a tribute to the famous Marilyn by Warhol, but here it's compiling, Yu Johan is compiling everything. Sui Jiangwu, who's also a professor at the China Academy, the Central Academy in Beijing, but he did also this new installation with Mao Zedong represented in the middle, and something much more subversive. This monumental sculpture by the Gao brothers, so mixing Pinocchio with the recognizable shape of the great leader. So now let's have a look after this socialist part and the ancient and literative part. Third element of this triptych is Western art, or let's say what is not Chinese, that has revived this modernity in the Chinese context. So I will start with Chen Yifei. Why Chen Yifei? So first of all, when you look at this image, you think of a picture, of a photograph, sorry. You think of a photograph, but it's actually a hyper-realistic painting and an oil painting. So here, one looks for a Western viewer very classical. It's a woman playing probably classical music in a very, let's say, traditional dress. Actually, in the Chinese context, is very different. So first, she's Western woman. This instrument is not so, it's not a traditional instrument in Chinese context. And then it's also an oil painting. So I, as mentioned earlier, oil painting is relatively, not completely, but relatively a new medium in the Chinese painting, because it's it used to be actually ink on paper and ink on silk. So a lot of different elements. And then on top of it, this skill and this extreme attention to the mimesis in that particular case. It's completely new. If you remember Castiglione portrait of the emperor, we can still recognize the feature of the emperor, but it's not hyper realistic or photographic like we can see even during the Flemish Renaissance in Europe. But this perspective changed drastically. And here you can have another example of this complexity of what is modern in Chinese, but one may not be seen as such from another perspective. But in the end, that's what makes it very interesting and deep. Looking at this dialogue with Western art, you can also have a more surprising dialogue, such as this installation. So this installation by Huang Yongping, actually to understand it, you need to go back to the origin. So this is actually a Middle Ages etching that you can see on your left-hand side. A very, let's say, ancient representation of Christian symbol. You have on top Jesus, the God, the Holy Spirit, and then in between you have Jesus on the cross, and then this is the danger of the hell, and so I'm making very, very simple. What matters most to understand Huang Yongping installation is that you don't have actually a representation of Jesus anymore. You have actually in between seated Buddhas. So that's actually a very interesting syncretic representation. And Huang Yongping actually find out that Nietzsche, the famous philosopher, did some comparison between the Buddha and Jesus. And they also have some crazy legend that Jesus, for a while, may have moved to Asia and learn about Buddhism. So that's actually historically it's not true, but the artist wanted actually to move a little bit this very strict separation between, let's say, Western religion and Eastern religion. And something else in the field of painting, this very famous representation of The Last Supper by Zhang Fengzhe. So here, of course, there is a clear dialogue with Western art. You recognize The Last Supper by Da Vinci, okay? That's very clear. But on top of it, there is also this socialist element that I have identified, because you can see that they all wear red scarf that actually linked to the red guard. So this actually, it's not only about one artist getting inspiration from Western art and do the painting. It's actually a more complex process. It's, let's say, mixing different sources of inspiration and making new and unique. So Last Supper, and then can come this question about, I keep on moving from west to east and east to west, and keep on saying that actually what is modern on one side may not be modern on the other side. So here comes the question, can modernity be a universal standard? And to illustrate this element, actually, I picked up two famous paintings. So the one by Zhang Fengzhe that I just showed you, and the Silk Screen by Andy Warhol, inspired from the same artwork. Actually, my position is actually we now live in a global world. So that will be actually a lost case to say, oh, this is Chinese, this is Western. Because now what interests the most the artist is to blend all these elements and to create and to get inspiration from different sides. So the idea is actually there is this rising interest for the concept of postmodernity, to get rid of this idea of that was modern and not traditional, and that was a kind of artistic revolution. Actually, there is not such a thing that an artistic revolution, a modernist revolution. Even for the most radical artwork, they are always grounded on a tradition. That's why they are interested, and that's why we still look at them. So this is why I will start to overview this postmodernity by debunking modernist myths, what I call modernist myths. What I mean by that is actually this idea that what is modern is completely new, almost, let's say, created ex nihilo. So surprisingly, to illustrate this idea, I wanted to take the example of architecture, because I find it quite interesting. You don't see this, let's say, strict separation, especially in the Chinese context. So here on top, you have actually some of the building of the China Academy of Art in Hangzhou, where I did my PhD. So very interesting shapes, as you can see. And Wang Shu, the architect, so famous Chinese architect, the first Chinese architect to get the Pritzker Prize. This architect has a keen interest in actually Chinese painting. And I picked up one Chinese painting, landscape painting, that could have actually be at the origin of this inspiration. I'm not sure if this is the only one or this specific one, but you can see this dialogue between actually architecture and traditional painting. And in Wang Shu architecture, it's actually quite present. On top here, you have ancient caves, including those in Dunhuang that I previously mentioned. And in the lower part, you have this modern museum in Ningbo, also created by Wang Shu. That actually reminds me a little bit this specific pattern of caves. So to debunk this modernist myth, we also need to go a little bit back to the Western context, because even for Mondrian's painting that you see on this slide on the right side, this is actually completely geometric. So as I've introduced you, we Westerners were not so familiar with this pure geometry with primary color. So it's often, this particular page is often mentioned as an icon of modernity in art, along with Malevich, square and cross. But actually, what looks revolutionary and very new has deep roots into artistic tradition. Because when we think of perspective, isometric perspective, we actually need also to integrate the grid. So the grid is what you see on the left part of the slide. So to have this hyper-realistic or realistic representation of the world, respecting this concept of mimesis, the artist actually had to look through this grid. So among the motivation of Mondrian was actually to unveil the structure, to almost, let's say, unveil the bones of Western art, and not specifically Western modern art. So the grid was an element that was actually at the core center. And if you're interested in this theme, I invite you to read the book by Rosalind Krauss about the myth of modernity and modernism. And what is interesting in the Chinese context, you can now see often this grid. So here I had this kind of parallel between Mondrian, one of the Mondrian late painting that actually start to be figurative, because if you look at the title, Broadway Boogie Woogie, it looks a little bit like a map of New York, the square line. So it's going back a little bit to figuration. And then on the other side, you have this portrait of Mao Zedong with this red grid. So you can definitely think of the Western artistic tradition, the roots of Renaissance. But in the Chinese context, you can also think of this particular red grid where during the imperial time, all the Chinese who ran for the imperial exam had to write their essays. So again, you have actually this kind of complex references that actually accumulate or accumulate. So that's actually why it's so deep and interesting. Because again, you can think this parallel of Mondrian, but also this literary element. So this particular painting is by Wang Guangyi, the same artist who did this painting reviving the Chinese propaganda with the Chanel logo. And this, let's say, myth of modernism, it's, from my perspective, also the case during the communist time. Because at first, after the revolution in 1949 and the establishment of the People's Republic of China, there was this idea to create a new world and to almost, let's say, give birth to a new kind of man. But there were still at that time some elements grounded on the ancient Chinese culture. One of them is actually the reference to Yu the Great. So Yu the Great is actually a legendary emperor from very, very ancient time, as you can see, the 2 millenniums BC. So we're not sure about who he was and when and what he did. But it was still in, especially in literature, remember, as the founder of the Chinese civilization. And the way Yu the Great is represented, sorry, he often has this gesture, hand gesture in front of him, as you can see. And this is actually a civilizational gesture, right? It's somehow how he created, let's say, the human condition and the world. Remember that the Chinese emperor came to heaven, so is really in between the human world and the Tianxia, the heaven. And even for a Marxist regime that has no link to religion and so on, you can see clearly here that there is some inspiration. And this, especially this hand gesture, showing the direction. So what was a civilizational gesture in You Look Great, it's, let's say, more, the gesture of a guide from the perspective of Mao Zedong. So then go a little bit more into details in this concept of postmodernity. I will first look at what comes from the East and move to the West, and then what came from the West and moved to the East. So you will understand with the different visual I will share with you. So this is a painting, as you can see, by François Boucher, a famous painter from the 18th century. If I would have hidden the name, you may think of a Chinese painting. And actually, this particular painter never went to China, but got some images, some lakes, some objects that were actually very precious at that time in the Western context, and here in particular in France. So even at this stage, you can see some influences in Western context. And remember that this is actually not so far from the time of Castiglione, this Italian Jesuit painter who did so many portraits of the emperor from Kanchi time, Kanchi period. And closer to us, what I want to demonstrate here is that actually the Chinese tradition has also deeply inspired Western modern art. So here's actually one of the clearest examples. Roy Lichtenstein is considered as a key figure of pop art, and he was deeply inspired by comics. And you can see all these dots is actually a revival of the specific printing system of comic book and printing industry, but this is doing everything by hand. And toward the end of his career and his life, he actually looked back at Chinese landscape painting and wanted to give a new, let's say, dimension and mix this Western background with the dots, something like very, very pop, very modern, with a spirit that he actually sourced from Chinese art. So different elements, so some are very geometric, very, and in the center, you have this moving shape, and you can see the brush strokes, and that's actually the symbolizing the fog and the fog moving. And in the lower left-hand side, you see this little branch that is actually very stylish, but still capture this specific Chinese representation of trees, especially pine trees. Another American artist, Brice Marden. So here, Brice Marden has always been deeply inspired by Chinese calligraphy, to the point that is actually integrated directly in his art. So it's still abstract, but he actually representing this abstract landscape, not so far from Jackson Pollock, actually, very gestural, as you can see, but he's definitely directly inspired by ancient calligraphy. And another artist, Fabienne Verdier, female painter from France. So she's actually studied in China for about 10 years and learned calligraphy from Chinese masters. And back to Europe, she actually articulated her own heritage, especially she liked particularly abstract American painting, but she's also blending it with some very typical Chinese elements. So the gesture, like here, it's extremely colorful. And she's using this huge brush. It's so huge that she needs a machine to move it. But then you have this very spontaneous brush stroke that you can see here that revives the spirit of calligraphy. And here it's another painting by Fabienne Verdier, a triptych with a tree branch. And sometimes actually the link is a bit obscure, but it's still a guess. This is a famous photography, actually, by Wolfgang Tilsmann. It's actually obtained with a mix of light and light on photographic paper. So it's not representing anything. But this actually reminds me a little bit the flow and the minimalism of Maren's painting from Song Dynasty. So I don't know if it's true or not, if Wolfgang Tissmann has knowledge of Chinese art, but actually it doesn't matter. What is very interesting when you overcome this barrier between Chinese, Western art and modern traditional, you can actually have your own dialogue like this particular one. And I will finish with something even more surprising. So here you have this tradition of yak butter sculpture in Tibet. So you really understand butter. It's actually a butter made out of milk. And in the whole Tibet, there is in some temple, there is this idea of and tradition of sculpting figures such as this, the one you see here, in butter. So of course it's extremely fragile. So I had the chance to visit a temple in Qinghai last summer, and they actually installed some fridge to preserve them. But actually the original idea is to let them decay, matching the core idea of Buddhism and reincarnation and things like that. So the decline and the decay of the sculpture was part of the idea. And surprisingly, I've seen, like in the American context, there is this festival of butter sculpture. So I'm definitely not so sure about the artistic value of this big, huge butter sculpture, but it's interesting to remember the Tibetan origin. So now, from west to east, so we are actually more familiar because there is this idea, and I'm strongly against it. There is this idea that modern Chinese art is actually directly inspired by Western art. So from my perspective, there are some elements that have enriched the Chinese cultural and artistic scene over the 20th and 21st century. There are elements, but it's not this unilateral process. So I will start again with Castiglione, with the perspective, but again, it's a dialogue. Castiglione has also deeply integrated some key element of the Chinese tradition. And starting from the seal, the three seals that you see on top, the red seal, the square one, with ancient Chinese characters. So here you have actually a very early interesting mix of, let's say, a Chinese perspective, Chinese tradition with Western perspective, all in one. And what is very interesting in the case of Castiglione, after he passed away, this particular style was kept by Chinese artists. So it was not just the contribution of Castiglione. Then after he passed away, other artists and Chinese artists continue this new style, new type of representing the emperor. And then that's the same idea with the modern masters. So here you have one of the biggest modern masters in Chinese art, Zhang Daqian. So Zhang Daqian is very interesting because he can do like what looks extremely traditional painting and some that will look more modern. Okay, so I selected two examples. So this lotus and mandarin ducks from the late 40s, and another landscape painting that from my perspective looks more modern, more abstract. You can still recognize some houses and so on, but there is this massive zone of green and blue, and if you isolate it, that could look actually like a very abstract painting. And keep in mind that Zhang Daqian has met during his lifetime Picasso, and he traveled all over the world. So he ended his life in Taiwan, but he kept on traveling and getting some inspiration from all over the world, including South America, Brazil. And Zauki, that's the same idea. Closer to us, Shuzhen, so this is the rising star of the art scene. And here you can see that he actually took ancient Greek and Roman sculpture that he designed to represent what looks like a 1,000-armed Buddha. So if you see the central installation, you see many, many arms. So every single sculpture are actually inspired by ancient Western sculpture, but all together, they look a little bit Buddhist or Asian. An interesting development. And I also like this new kind of landscape. So it's a photograph, as you may guess. So reviving this tradition of landscape painting, but with real part of the human body. So you may not recognize at first, but these are real parts. So I find it interesting because if you remember, when we look at Wang Meng's painting, I mentioned the spine of the bell. So here there is something very organic that comes back actually. And this is also another example by Yang, but I will go over it. If I'm right, I still have 10 minutes, isn't it?
Right, yeah, you have 10 minutes.
Yeah, perfect. So that's just the time I need to finish. To go a little bit beyond this idea of postmodernity, I also want to pinpoint the complexity of East Asia. I kept on speaking about China, okay, that the Zhongguo, the central country, but there is also North and South Korea, there is Japan, of course, Vietnam. Vietnam has historically been deeply influenced by Chinese art, Chinese thought, and so on. So I call this last part From East to Further East to add a little bit more complexity to our topic, but actually I find it even more rewarding in the end. So to explain what I want to talk about, I will actually develop my own interpretation of this particular installation, so entitled Head On, and this installation that you have on the lecture's invitation. So I've seen it in real. I was surprised to see that it's actually not exactly taxidermized animal. They are made out of human animal hair, but some of them actually are recreated. But that's not an issue. The overall impression is extremely stunning. So you see this movement, you see this amazing installation. You see also like two viewers in the center, so you can imagine the scale of this installation. And there is this square of glass in the back of this installation where all this wolf will hit the glass. So why I want to insist on that? At first, it's a little bit difficult to identify as something typically Chinese. But then you may think of the wave, you may think of different symbols, and yeah, so that's a little bit obscure. But my major surprise is when I discovered this painting by Fujita. As you can see here on the slide on the left side. So Fujita, who's Fujita? Is actually a modern master from Japan, born in Japan, and he spent most of his career in the end in Paris, among the other modern masters. So among different type of paintings, he tried actually to explore his own style as, let's say, a Japanese artist exiled in Western countries. So doing so, he didn't want to imitate all the modern masters. So I think this combat cat struggle here is an example, because the use of colors and this aerial perspective, you really see, it's not hyper realistic, but you really see these cats hang in the air, right? It's really like there is this idea of decides this moment, right? It's almost, let's say, like an instant shot that capture the precious time when the cats are almost flying. So when now you look at the Taiguoqiang installation from the glass, it's very interesting to see that the shape and the arrangement of the animal is very, very similar. So I haven't got the confirmation that Taiguoqiang knows this particular painting. But I feel like it's so clear to me. And when I turn it in different sides, I always actually come to the same conclusion. And this particular screen actually amplifies the effect, because the screen means like grid or something two-dimensional. So that attract our attention to actually cut the installation and actually isolate this particular perspective through this glass. And when we look back at the Fujita painting, we feel like there may be a glass. So that's extremely interesting. And so why I find it interesting also is because, again, it's a Japanese artist. So don't underestimate the importance of Japan also. I mostly focus on Western art, but Japan has a very, very important and key role, partly because actually Japan modernized a little bit earlier than China. So a lot of Chinese artists actually moved to Japan, and the first link to Western tradition actually was in Japan, but from the prism of Japanese artists. So there is a very interesting, let's say, process of transformation from West to Far East, and then back to China. So the wave also, I mean, if you look at this big wave, this powerful things, although these are made of animals, I cannot prevent myself from thinking of the big wave by Hokusai as well. So that makes actually it extremely Japanese in the end, altogether. And last point, to close a bit our cycle, remember that Van Gogh, one of the greatest masters, was also deeply inspired by Japanese art. So in the end, and here's my conclusion, to, let's say, wrap it up a little bit and ended up with simple ideas. I think to approach modernity in Chinese art, there are two traps to avoid. The first one is a trap of your own ethnocentrism, because you're familiar with something that you're surrounded with. So don't always take this as a starting point. Trying to open up and see how rich it could be. And then you can actually come back to your own civilization, your own cultural background. And Chinese art actually is extremely enlightening for that. And the second trap is actually this trap of modernism, the one I developed a little bit earlier, this idea that modernity is a new start. It's the start from ex nihilo. It's a revolution, basically. But even in the revolutionary context, we've seen that there is not, let's say, so radical revolution. There is always the continuation of something that started before. So, and this type of modernism, I will let you think of this particular question. But in the end, actually, what is modern? It might be actually the most ancient thing. That's something I keep on trying to develop. If we look at very beautiful ancient Chinese painting, and we still find it beautiful, would that mean that this is extremely modern in the end, and maybe more modern than the modern art we have now, and that is kept on being produced nowadays? So I'll let you digest this idea, but ethnocentrism and modernism actually are the biggest enemy, I think, to overview everything. So thank you very much. Here's the end. I will welcome your questions, if any.
Remi, thank you very much for your very interesting and curious lecture. I have visited and heard a lot of your reports and your works in Beijing University, in Dunhuan Academy, and King's College London, and I always wondering, like, your works are always made on very high professional and academic level. Yeah, it's really great. Thank you very much. It's great interest to listen to your lecture. Thank you. And now we have some questions in chat.
Yeah, I see them. Let me open it.
Yeah. There are several questions.
Feel free to select some. Malevich, where? So about Malevich again, I just wanted to showcase the complexity. So I'm not saying that Malevich actually took inspiration in Chinese characters. What I want to identify is actually this keen interest from ancient time in China for geometry, something that we may not be that familiar. And if I go back to the characters, I don't know if you still have my phone. No, I'm not showing my screen. Do I?
Yeah, we see
you still see it?
Okay. Yeah.
Well, I will try to go back.
Uh-huh.
This was actually developed by An Cheng and lots of sinologists about this importance of Mingtong and the resilience of the square form. Not only art and architecture, but also the Chinese thought was structured within the square. So that actually summarized, and that's the abstract version of the whole world. Basically, there is the emperor in the middle and the rest of the world with four direction, and that's actually the whole Chinese cosmos. So again, I'm not an expert first on Malevich. I just find that there are some very interesting parallels, because it's also sometimes you realize that there is actually a very humanist vibes. You may actually, that will be more, let's say, more anthropologist perspective, but you realize that we think with some common elements of the square, the round, and so speaking about anthropology, for example, Lévi-Strauss and so on, demonstrated that our way of thinking comes partly from very basic observation, such as the raw and the cooked, or the fresh and the rotten. So sometimes from very different side of the world, we ended up with things that are quite similar. So again, don't take me wrong. I'm not saying that there is an articulation between Chinese character and Malevich. I just want to illustrate that there's a very interesting a similar interest into geometry. That's it.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I see some comments about ethnocentrism. This is something I realized when I lived in China, because so I'm not so familiar with the Russian context, but I can say that as a French national, we often have this idea that the French way of thinking is universal. That's it's not French, it's universal, it's for everyone. And once you arrive in China, you just realize, no, I mean, that's French people being universal. And then that was a key element for me to understand more in depth the Chinese art and culture. I kind of decentered my way of thinking. And at the same time, I find that it's actually very pleasant, because at one point you will come back to your own cultural background, of course, but with the enrichment of this, let's say, Chinese exiles, this Chinese exploration. And now I feel a little bit I'm Chinese in the end, so I'm not, obviously, but this, let's say, discovery from China is, even in my daily life, it's extremely important. So maybe other question. Yeah, like I have this possible interpretation with this square hui, like going back to return. That's actually, I'm not sure about Malevich extension, but that's actually a great example how, let's say, the knowledge of Chinese culture will empower you. You may think after through the lens of Chinese characters. So that, I find it very interesting. Now to look at this black square as yeah, it's supposed to be modern, but Hui, it's going back, so including going back home. That's actually very interesting, and that will definitely challenge the this idea of modernity. So yeah, very interesting insight. You may open your microphone if you have any question. We're getting toward the end. If not, I will just show again my contact details if you want to communicate after. So as you know now, I did my PhD in the China Academy of Art. This is a place that I still recommend. I think it's a very interesting place to study. And I also remember that I had a lot of Russian classmates, and a lot of them were great in learning Chinese and have already much deeper knowledge of Chinese culture before moving to China and studying at the China Academy of Art. So if you consider about, let's say, going on a scholarship, China at the moment, mainland China is extremely welcoming foreigners. So you may get scholarship that will include a waiver of tuition fee, monthly allowance, and free accommodation. So that's actually a very good condition. And I actually, when I graduated, I think I had 3 Russian classmates. And yeah, that's a perspective that you can, if you like. So Zhongguo Meishu-Shui-Wen Hangzhou, also the Central Academy in Beijing, Zhongyang Meishu-Shui-Wen, or Ishu-Shui-Wen, I forgot.
Remi, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Like in chat, you can see one more question from Elena Kasimova, because she asked in the beginning of chat, so she.
It's at the beginning of the chat or at the end?
Yeah, in the end now. Like, dear Mr.
Okay.
Jarry, thank you for your exciting lecture.
Okay. What is your opinion about Ai Weiwei art, for example, about his famous and Okay. So I will go step by step. First question. Ai Weiwei, very interesting case. So it's actually for this particular installation with the porcelain seeds. This is not so far from Liu Dianhua, this Chinese artist based in Shanghai, working almost exclusively with porcelain. But with the case of Ai Weiwei, is mixing different media. But for this particular porcelain seed, they were actually made with traditional techniques in China. Ai Weiwei actually is a very famous artist in the Western world, a little bit less famous in mainland China. And for political reason, there is a clear tension. So what we can see for this modern and contemporary art scene, there are Chinese artists that are very famous in China only, some Chinese that are famous in China and abroad, and some Chinese artists that are more famous abroad. So beside this political, let's say, issue regarding Ai Weiwei, I find out actually some, let's say, liberal artists in China are not so fan of Ai Weiwei's work because they find it systematically political. So they consider that art should look at other fields or not so frontally political. Personally, I follow his work. Some installations are very interesting, for sure. Can you recommend some modern artists who make porcelain? Which countries, cities, museums? Chinese. So for porcelain, there are a lot. But I would say Liu Dianhua is quite an interesting artist because he really stick to ceramics. And about ceramics, what is also interesting is to see the Western art scene. Now ceramic has become a media for sculpture. So a lot of Western artists actually use ceramic as their main medium. Joan Cretton, many artists. So it's not only, let's say, a Chinese phenomenon. Again, the borders have folded. And if you have the chance to go to China, go to Jingdezhen. That's actually the ancient capital for ceramics. I had the chance to visit it, and you have ancient kiln, and that's fantastic. Hangzhou also have a very ancient kiln from Song Dynasty. And then which country, cities, museum have the best contemporary Chinese art collection? Very difficult to say because you have private collections. So Ulisik is often mentioned, but he's giving his collection to the M+ Museum in Hong Kong. Sometimes you have great temporary exhibition all over the world. Moscow, I've seen that at the garage. I think that's the name of the art space. One of the artists I mentioned, Huang Yongping, he had one of his last installation. One of his last installation was exhibited for the first time in Moscow, and it's called American Kitchen. So don't think that there is it's all the prairie is always greener outside. I do think that in Russia, Moscow and other cities, you have great opportunity. Also because of the historical link and the cultural exchange between China and Russia. So if you pay attention, if you follow, let's say, the new exhibition, I'm sure that you will see, I will pay great money to go to Moscow at that time to see the installation of Huang Yongping. That was not possible. So, and then, but to be more specific, like which country, that's very difficult to say. I find that surprisingly, Australia has a very good understanding of the contemporary art scene, because Australia is Western, but in Asia Pacific, their biggest neighbor is China. It's not the UK or the US. So then they felt that they need to understand their big neighbors. And there is now quite a long-lasting tradition of sinology, with some sinologists coming from the West and training new generations. So I remember, for example, in Museum of Sydney, very interesting, and that was probably one of the first one, great exhibition of Chinese art. But that may not solve your issue because that's super far, even from me now. But again, look in different circles around you. I'm sure that you will find interesting artwork. Art fairs also are interesting to attend. There are some in Moscow and different cities. Yeah.
And we also can mention MoMA in New York. Yes, there is also a great collection of contemporary Chinese art. Yeah, and about Australia, yeah, last August I was in Melbourne, in Australia, and I visited Tsai Guotian exhibitions there. So it was really great. I was really amazed by his art, by his by his exhibition. Yeah.
And that your reference to MoMA is interesting, and New York, because you may also look at the museum that have a specific curator for Asian art and Chinese art. And that's the case of a lot of American museums, and also the Guggenheim Museum. So the last greatest show that I have seen was organized by Guggenheim Museum. So it started in New York. It was entitled Theater of the World. So it's a reference to a work of Huang Yongping, again, a very important figure of the art scene. And then he moved to different cities, including Bilbao in Spain. And that's how I was able to see it. So sometimes a show that started in the US may actually come closer to you. That's the idea of this traveling exhibition.
Yeah, thank you very much.
So if no more questions, thank you very much. That was a very exciting experience for me. So I could not see you physically, but just this idea of communicating with Europe or Eurasia is a very interesting perspective, especially as a French national speaking about Chinese art. That's extremely global in the end.
Thank you very much for this global lecture. Yeah, thank you very much for agreement to become a part of our educational project, and we are really glad to see you during this lectures. Thank you very much.
Oh.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.